Chapter 1. The Sound of Silence. Have you ever felt like you are a ghost in a room full of people? You speak, but no one truly listens. You post, but no one truly cares. You are surrounded by noise, yet you have never felt more alone. Today, we begin a journey for those who are tired of being forgotten. Welcome to Level Up Graded Readers. This is where your transformation begins. The silence in Elias's apartment was not peaceful. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears and makes your chest feel tight. He sat on the edge of his bed, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. His phone lay face down on the floor. For 3 hours, it had not vibrated. Not one message, not one call, not even a notification from the social media apps he checked 100 times a day. Just 1 month ago, Elias thought he was the center of the world. He had a high-status job, a fast-paced life, and a circle of friends who laughed at all his jokes. But then, the company collapsed. The status vanished. And, like magic, the people disappeared too. He realized a terrifying truth: the world didn't love Elias. The world loved what Elias had. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He saw a man who had spent years building a life of straw. He had focused on shallow connections and social noise. But he had built nothing inside himself, without the noise of the world to distract him. He was forced to face the man in the mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. He saw a man who was empty. He saw a man who was average. "I am lonely," he whispered. The words felt like lead in his mouth. He felt the suffocating weight of being forgotten. He realized that for years, he had been running away from silence because silence told the truth. Silence told him that he had no real skills. Silence told him that he had no deep purpose. He was like a hollow tree, impressive on the outside, but rotting on the inside. He walked to his kitchen and looked at the pile of unopened mail. His life was a mess of waiting. Waiting for someone to call. Waiting for someone to give him a job. Waiting for someone to tell him he was important. He was a victim of his own need for attention. But as he stood there in the dark, a different thought began to grow. It was a cold, sharp thought. He looked at his silent phone again. If no one was watching him, then no one could judge him. If no one was talking to him, then no one could distract him. He realized a profound secret of the great masters. Loneliness is the poverty of self. Solitude is the richness of self. Most people are terrified of being alone because they do not like the person they are alone with. Elias decided, right then, that he would change that person. He would stop being a victim of loneliness. He would become a master of solitude. He reached down and picked up his phone. He didn't check his messages. He didn't look at the news. He walked to a kitchen drawer, dropped the phone inside, and turned the key. The blue light was gone. The fake world was gone. His apartment felt different now. It was no longer a prison where he was waiting to be rescued. It was becoming a workshop, a fortress of solitude. He felt a spark of fear. But beneath the fear, there was a strange, new energy. It was the energy of a man who has finally stopped running. He looked at his hands. They were empty, but they were ready to work. He looked at the clock. It was midnight. The rest of the world was sleeping, lost in their dreams and their shallow distractions. Elias was awake. For the first time in his life, he was truly awake. He had accepted the reality of his failure. He had faced the pain of being forgotten. But as he sat down at his empty desk, a massive question hung in the air, heavier than the silence itself. Could a man who had spent his entire life seeking the applause of others truly survive when the lights went out? Or would the silence eventually drive him mad? Chapter 2. The Distraction Trap. The silence in the apartment began to speak, and it told a story that Elias did not want to hear. To understand why Elias was standing in a dark room with a locked phone, we must look back at the roots of his struggle. A man does not wake up one day and find himself empty. He empties himself slowly, day by day, through the small choices he makes. For 10 years, Elias had been a master of distraction. Distraction is a silent killer of dreams. It doesn't scream. It whispers. His life was a constant escape from the reality of his own lack of growth. Every morning, the moment his eyes opened, he reached for his phone. He fed his brain with the opinions of strangers, the news of distant places, and the fake happiness of people he barely knew. He was addicted to the social noise. He remembered the Friday nights spent in crowded bars, surrounded by people who called themselves his friends. They would drink, they would laugh, and they would talk for hours about nothing. They talked about celebrities. They complained about their jobs. And they made plans for next year. But no one ever talked about mastery. No one ever talked about the hard, quiet work of building a skill. Elias joined them because he was terrified of being alone with his own thoughts. In the crowd, he felt important. In the noise, he felt alive. But it was a fake life. He was using the crowd to hide from the fact that he was stagnant. He was like a beautiful boat with no engine. He looked good as long as the tide was moving. But he had no power of his own. He looked back at the snooze button cycle that had defined his 20s. He would delay his work to go to a party. He would postpone his studies to scroll through social media. He was always looking for the next hit of dopamine. The next like, the next notification. He was so afraid of being alone that he forgot how to be himself. His struggle was rooted in the fear of being average. Yet every action he took was an average action. He followed the path of least resistance. He chose comfort over challenge. He chose the applause of the crowd over the respect of his own soul. He realized that for a decade, he had been building a prison of shallow connections. The weight of these wasted years felt like iron on his shoulders. He looked at the kitchen drawer where his phone was locked away. He could feel the ghost of his old self reaching for the key. His brain was begging for a distraction, for a bit of noise to drown out the voice of regret. The root of his pain was not that he was alone now. The root of his pain was that he had spent his entire life running away from this exact moment. He had used the world to avoid himself. And now that the world was gone, he was a stranger in his own mind. The silence was getting louder. His hands were shaking from the lack of noise. He was at a crossroads between the man who runs and the man who stays. Could he face the dark roots of his past without being pulled back into the trap of comfort? Or would the hunger for distraction finally break his will? Chapter 3. The cold truth. The final blow to Elias's old life did not come from his enemies, but from the people he had called his brothers. It was a cold Tuesday morning when the reality of his situation finally shattered the last piece of his ego. After the company collapsed, Elias believed that his social network would be his safety net. He believed that the years of being there for every party and every drink would mean something when he was the one in need. He reached out to his closest friends, asking for a small lead on a new job or even just a conversation to steady his mind. The responses were like ice. "I'm really busy right now." "Man," one said, "let's catch up when things are better for you," said another. By the third day, the messages stopped coming entirely. The social noise that had defined his life for a decade was replaced by a terrifying, hollow silence. He realized he was not a person to them. He was just a character in their play. This was his breaking point. The world was no longer tolerating his excuses or his need for comfort. Elias walked through the city streets, feeling like a ghost. He saw people laughing in cafes, their phones glowing with notifications, and their lives moving fast. He felt invisible. He realized that rock bottom isn't just about having no money. It is about having no value in a world that only respects results. He arrived at his apartment and saw a letter taped to his door. It was a final notice for his rent. He looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man looking back was tired, broken, and small. He didn't recognize himself. The eyes were filled with the shame of 1,000 wasted hours. He realized that his comfort zone had actually been a slow-motion suicide for his potential. He sat on the floor of his empty living room, the quiet anger in his chest burning like a cold fire. He felt a deep, painful disgust for the man who feared the silence, and the man who traded his greatness for a like. The pain was no longer something to run from. It was a signal. It was the signal that the old Elias had to die so that a new version could be born. The apartment felt like a prison cell. But for the first time, Elias didn't want to leave. He realized that if he ran away now, he would be running for the rest of his life. He looked at the shadows on the wall. He had no job, no status, and no friends. He had lost everything that the world told him was important. He was standing at the edge of the abyss. The silence was judge, jury, and executioner. He had lost everything else. Was he about to lose himself too? Or would this humiliation finally force him to build a foundation that no one could ever take away? Chapter 4. The decision to disappear. The darkness of the apartment was no longer just a place. It was a mirror. Elias lay on his back in the middle of the living room floor, staring at the ceiling. The silence was so absolute that he could hear the thumping of his own heart. In the past, this silence would have driven him to grab his phone, to call anyone, or to turn on the TV just to hear a human voice. But tonight, he stayed still. He was tired of running. Inside his mind, a war was raging. Two voices were fighting for his future. The first voice was the old Elias, the victim. It whispered, "This is too much. You are not built for this. Call Leo. Apologize. Tell them you were just having a bad week. Maybe they will take you back into the circle. You don't need to be great. You just need to be comfortable. But then, a second voice arose. This voice was quiet, cold, and sharp. It didn't offer comfort. It offered the truth. It asked the one question that changed everything. If you don't change tonight, when will you change? If you go back now, you are admitting that you are worth nothing without the approval of others. If not now, then when Elias sat up, he realized that his life had been a series of tomorrows that never arrived. He had been a spectator of his own life, watching others grow while he stayed the same. He walked to the bathroom and splashed ice-cold water on his face. He looked at himself, really looked at himself, and saw the man he had been hiding from. He saw the potential that he had buried under years of shallow noise. I will not be a victim of my own loneliness anymore. He whispered, I will not be lonely. I will be focused. He made a silent promise to the man in the reflection. He wasn't just setting a goal. He was making a life and death decision. He decided to go dark. No more seeking attention. No more looking for likes. He decided to disappear from the world to find the man the world had made him forget. He walked to his desk and cleared away the old trash, the old letters, and the old distractions. He left only a single lamp and a blank notebook. He sat down and wrote 4 words at the top of the first page: the fortress of solitude. This was his new reality. He was cutting off the noise to find the signal. He was trading the applause of the crowd for the respect of his own soul. He felt a strange, cold peace. He wasn't happy, but he was determined. He realized that his new life would cost him his old one. And for the first time, he was more than willing to pay the price. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. He was the architect of a new one. He locked the door to his apartment. He was officially alone. The world was gone. Now, the real work was about to begin. Chapter 5. Entering the fortress. The silence of the first morning in the fortress was not a sanctuary. Elias woke up at 5:00 a.m., not to the sound of a notification, but to the cold reality of his own choice. The room was freezing, and the darkness felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. Every muscle in his body begged him to crawl back into the warmth of his blankets, the same warmth that had kept him average for a decade. This was the hard departure. It was the moment he had to cut the invisible strings connecting him to his old, lazy life. His hand instinctively reached for the nightstand where his phone usually sat. But his fingers only met the cold, hard wood. A sharp wave of anxiety hit him. Without the noise, he felt naked. He felt small. He realized that his constant need for distraction was a drug, and he was now going through withdrawal. The hardest walk is the one you take alone, but it is the walk that makes you strongest. He whispered to the shadows. His voice sounded strange and hollow in the empty room. He forced himself to stand up. The floorboards creaked under his feet. A lonely sound that echoed his isolation. He walked to the kitchen and splashed ice-cold water on his face until his skin burned. He looked into the mirror and saw the fear in his own eyes. The fear of a man who no longer had a crowd to hide in. He sat at his desk. The blank page of his notebook was staring back at him, demanding a purpose. In the past, he would have called a friend to avoid this feeling of emptiness. Now, there was no one to call. There was only the silence and the work. He began to write. His pen scratching against the paper, the only sound in his universe. He was learning that solitude is not the absence of people, but the presence of self. By 6:00 a.m., the urge to quit was screaming in his ears. His brain was searching for an escape, a reason to stop, a way to return to the comfortable prison of his old habits. But Elias stayed in his chair. He realized that every minute he spent in this discomfort was a brick being laid in his new foundation. He was no longer a victim of the dark. He was becoming the master of it. The world outside was still asleep, unaware that a war was being fought in a small, quiet room. Elias had successfully left the shore of his old life. But the new land was nowhere to be seen. He was in the middle of a vast, silent ocean. The silence was screaming. Would he break under the pressure of his own solitude? Or would he find the strength to keep walking into the void? Chapter 6. Mending the Mind. The first week was a battle of survival. But the second week became a battle of systems. Elias soon realized that his fortress of solitude would only stand if he built it with the bricks of discipline. In the absence of a boss, a crowd, or a clock to watch, Elias had to become his own master. He began to build a ritual, a sacred blueprint for his soul that turned the chaotic silence into a sharp, focused weapon. Every day, at 5:00 a.m., the war began. He didn't wait for motivation, because he knew that motivation is a liar that disappears when the room is cold. Instead, he relied on the machine of his own habits. He started with physical movement. In the dim light of his living room, he pushed his body until his muscles screamed and sweat dripped onto the floor. This was not just exercise. It was the process of killing his old, soft self. After the physical battle came the mental one. He sat at his desk for hours, mending his mind and learning his craft. He practiced his English out loud, repeating phrases until they felt like part of his DNA. He studied complex designs, his pen moving fast across his notebook, capturing ideas that only come to those who are quiet enough to hear them, without the distraction of emails or the blue light of social media. His brain began to change. He was moving from shallow work to deep work. He realized that discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. There were moments when his back ached and his eyes burned from the effort. There were mornings when he wanted to scream at the empty walls just to hear another voice. But he kept going. He learned to find a strange, quiet joy in the repetition. He wasn't just working. He was training. He was sweating over his notebook, his focus becoming a laser that cut through the fog of his past. Slowly, the chaos in his apartment began to disappear because his mind was becoming organized. He cleaned his desk every night. He prepped his simple meals with care. He was no longer a man reacting to the world. He was a man leading himself. He felt a new kind of power growing, a power that didn't need the applause of others to stay alive. He was becoming a machine of consistency. His body was sharpening. His mind was tightening. And for the first time, he felt a sense of pride when he looked in the mirror. He was building a foundation of iron in the middle of a silent world. But a machine needs more than just power. It needs a soul. He was becoming strong. But the shadows of his old life were watching from the corners of the room. How much pressure could his new discipline handle before his heart started to long for the noise again? Chapter 7. The Shadow of Doubt. As the third week began, Elias hit the wall. It was not a physical wall made of stone, but a psychological wall made of exhaustion and the sudden, sharp return of the old Elias. The initial excitement of his new life had completely vanished. In its place was a deep, bone-weary fatigue that seemed to settle in his very soul. His muscles ached from the training, and his brain felt slow and heavy from the hours of isolation. One Friday evening, the silence of the fortress became deafening. Outside his window, the city was alive. He could hear the distant sound of music from a bar 3 blocks away. He could hear the laughter of groups of people walking past his building. Usually, he would be out there, part of the noise, part of the crowd. But tonight, he was here, alone in a quiet room with nothing but his books and his thoughts. The shadow of doubt began to grow in the corners of the room. "Why are you doing this?" the voice whispered in his mind. "You've been alone for weeks, and the world hasn't noticed. You're working hard, but no one is cheering for you. Your friends are out there having fun, and you're in here, acting like a monk. You're wasting your life." He looked at his notebook. The English phrases he had practiced so hard suddenly looked like meaningless marks on a page. The designs he had created looked amateur. The pressure of his own high expectations began to crush him. He felt a violent urge to grab the key to the kitchen drawer, take out his phone, and call anyone just to hear a voice that wasn't his own. He wanted to surrender to the comfort of his old, average life. This was the ultimate test of his discipline. Most people fail here because they think that growth is a straight line. They don't realize that the wall is not there to stop you. The wall is there to see how much you truly want it. Elias realized that if he broke now, he would never be able to trust himself again. He would be a slave to his distractions forever. He stood up, his legs shaking with fatigue, and walked to the window. He watched the people below. They looked happy, but he knew the truth. They were running from the same silence he was now facing. They were afraid of the very thing that was making him strong. Your greatest enemy is not the world. It is the man you were yesterday. He whispered to the glass. He turned his back on the window and the city lights. He sat back down at his desk. He didn't feel inspired. He didn't feel powerful. He felt miserable. But he picked up his pen anyway. He forced his eyes to stay open. He forced his mind to focus on one single word. Then one single sentence. He was no longer working for success. He was working for survival. He was fighting for his right to be more than average. The wall was high, and it was thick. Every fiber of his being was screaming for rest and comfort. The silence was a judge, and the verdict was coming. Would he climb over the wall and keep moving toward the light? Or would he let the shadow of doubt pull him back into the darkness of the crowd? Chapter 8. The Skill Awakens. The wall did not fall all at once. It crumbled piece by piece. After the brutal night of doubt, Elias woke up with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years' clarity. The noise of his old life was finally fading, and in its place was a sharp, Focused resonance. He realized that he wasn't just surviving the silence anymore. He was starting to speak through it. The first small win happened on a Tuesday morning. Elias had been working on a complex architectural design, a project he had started in the second week of his isolation. Usually, his mind would wander after 30 minutes, reaching for the ghost of his phone. But today, the clock struck 4 hours, and he hadn't moved. He looked at his work and saw something different. The lines were cleaner. The logic was deeper. He had mastered a technique that used to baffle him. A warm surge of pride, real pride. Not the fake ego of a like or a follow filled his chest. He didn't need to post it online to know it was good. The work spoke for itself. He realized that solitude is where greatness is born. Without the distraction of others' opinions, he had finally learned to trust his own eyes. Later that day, he opened an advanced English business journal. 2 months ago, the vocabulary would have felt like a barrier. But as he read, the sentences flowed. He understood the nuances, the tone, and the complex grammar. He began to write his thoughts in English, his pen moving with a steady, confident rhythm. He wasn't just learning a language, he was gaining a new voice. Small wins are the fuel for giant victories. He wrote in the margin of his notebook. He felt a sense of momentum, a quiet power that made his footsteps feel lighter in the apartment. He was no longer a man in hiding. He was a man in training. He began to see that his fortress of solitude was working. The skills he was honing in the dark were becoming sharp enough to cut through the noise of the world. He felt a sense of control over his life that he had never known before. He had turned his loneliness into a workshop, and the products of that workshop were starting to shine. He felt invincible. He felt as though he could handle anything the world threw at him. But life rarely allows a smooth path to the top. Just as Elias began to feel the warmth of hope, a cold shadow began to stretch across his door. A final, brutal test was coming, one that wouldn't just challenge his skills, but would threaten to destroy the very soul of the man he was becoming. He had built his foundation, but was it strong enough to survive a storm that was designed to take everything he had left? Chapter 9. The Ghost of the Past. Just as the sun began to rise on Elias's new life, the sky turned black. Life does not test you when you are weak. It tests you when you are finally strong enough to be worth breaking. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning. It started with a phone call from his sister. Their mother had been rushed to the hospital with a sudden illness. The fear hit Elias like a physical weight, crushing the breath out of his lungs. But the world was not finished with him yet. An hour later, he received an email from the one company he had truly hoped to join. They were closing the position due to a budget cut. In a single morning, the two pillars of his hope were kicked away. Elias sat on his bed, the room cold and the air heavy. He felt a familiar darkness creeping back into his mind. The voices of doubt, which had been quiet for weeks, returned with a roar. Why did you try? You stayed in this room for nothing. You worked hard for nothing. The universe doesn't care about your discipline. You are still the same invisible man. He didn't open his books. He didn't practice his English. He didn't even turn on the light. He sat in the shadows, watching the rain hit the window glass. like thousands of tiny bullets. Every muscle in his body felt like it was made of lead. The physical and emotional exhaustion he had been pushing away finally caught up to him. He felt deeply. Painfully alone, he looked at the kitchen drawer where his phone was locked, the machine that had once been his only connection to the world. Now, it just looked like a cruel joke. He felt a violent urge to break the lock, to call his old friends, and to beg for a distraction. He wanted to surrender to the warmth of being average again. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered to the empty room. His voice was broken, stripped of all the power it had gained. He lay down on the floor, watching the shadows on the wall. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a vast, black hole, and the old Elias was reaching out from the darkness to pull him back in. The clock ticked in the silence. Midnight. Elias didn't prepare his notes for tomorrow. He didn't plan his workout. He didn't care because he didn't believe in the fortress anymore. The stars cannot shine without the darkness. But in this moment, Elias could see no stars, only the deep, suffocating night of the soul. He sat in the dark, his heart empty and his spirit cold. The alarm remained dark. For the first time in months, Elias did not move. Was this the end of his journey? Or was the darkness just the stage for a light he could not yet see? Chapter 10. Master of the Silence. The room was freezing. It was 5:00 a.m. But the alarm was silent. Elias lay in the darkness, his eyes open but his heart cold. He had every reason to stay in bed. His mother was sick. His dream job was gone, and his energy was depleted. The old Elias whispered in his ear, "See, life is unfair. Just sleep. It doesn't matter anymore." But then, something happened in the absolute silence of the room. He didn't think about money. He didn't think about his boss. He thought about the man he saw in the mirror months ago, the man who was a ghost, a victim, a shadow. He realized that if he stayed in bed now, he wasn't just losing a morning. He was killing the only version of himself that he actually respected. Real power is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to move through it. Elias felt a tiny spark of heat in his chest. It was the heat of a promise. He didn't get up because he felt motivated. He got up because he had given his word to himself. And a man's word is his only true currency. With a slow, heavy movement, he sat up. He didn't turn on the light. He sat in the dark for a moment, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. "I am not what happened to me," he whispered, his voice gaining strength. "I am what I choose to become." He stood up. He didn't feel happy. He felt dangerous. He felt like a warrior who had survived the worst of the storm and realized that the wind couldn't break him. He went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. But this time, he didn't shiver. The ice felt like a brother. He was no longer a victim of his environment. He was the master of his inner state. He walked to his desk. He didn't wait for the hospital to call with good news. He didn't wait for another job offer. He opened a blank notebook and wrote day 1 of the new era. He realized that the world can take your job, your money, and even your comfort. But it can never take your discipline unless you give it away. By 6:00 a.m., The sun began to bleed through the clouds. It wasn't a soft, gentle light. It was a fierce, golden fire. Elias looked out the window and saw the city beginning to wake up. For the first time, he didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own life. He felt like the owner of the dawn. His mind was no longer a mess of fear. It was a weapon of pure focus. He realized that the dark night was not meant to stop him. It was meant to burn away the last pieces of the old. Weak Elias, so that the new man could finally be born. He felt an explosive energy running through his veins. He was no longer running away from his problems. He was hunting for solutions. He picked up his phone and called his sister. He didn't speak with fear. He spoke with a calm, steady strength that surprised even himself. He told her he was coming to the hospital. But first, he was going to finish his work. He was going to be the rock that his family needed. The fortress of solitude was no longer a place he lived in. It was a power he carried inside him. He was no longer just a man with a schedule. He was a man with a mission. Chapter 11. The Return of the King. The world belongs to those who are still awake when the sun finally breaks through the clouds. After the storm of the dark night and the resurrection of his spirit, Elias did not just return to his routine. He accelerated. He realized that success is not a gift given by others, but a territory you must conquer with your own hands. 3 months later, an opportunity appeared that would decide the future of his career. A top-tier firm announced a competition for a massive urban development project. It was the kind of high-stakes battle that Elias had dreamed of in his old life. But back then, he was too distracted to ever win it. Now, the playing field was different. While his competitors were networking at parties and drinking endless cups of coffee to stay awake after late nights of shallow effort, Elias was winning the war before 8:00 a.m. in the sacred silence of his fortress of solitude. He had already spent hundreds of hours sharpening his craft. He used his improved English skills to research global architectural trends and communicate with international experts in their own time zones. He wasn't just working harder. He was working with a level of intensity that the others couldn't match. He had spent so much time alone that he had learned to hear the details that others missed in the noise. The day of the final presentation arrived. The boardroom was filled with tension. His former friends and rivals were there, looking exhausted and nervous. When it was Elias's turn, he stood up. He didn't feel the old fear of being judged. He felt a calm, steady power. He looked at the executives with eyes that had seen the sunrise every day for months. He spoke with clarity. He spoke with conviction. Every word was precise. And every design choice was backed by the thousands of hours of study he had put in while the world was dark. He didn't just present a plan. He presented a vision. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, the chairman of the board stood up. He didn't just offer a handshake. He offered respect. Elias, the chairman said, your design is excellent, but your presence is what caught my attention. You look like a man who has mastered himself. Elias won the contract. He was offered a leadership role with a salary that changed his life forever. He received news that his mother had fully recovered, and she was there to see him accept the award. The people who had ignored him months ago began to call his phone again. His inbox was full of notifications. The world was finally shouting his name. But as he stood on the stage, bathed in the golden light of the cameras, Elias felt something strange. He didn't feel the rush of dopamine he used to crave from the crowd. He looked at the applause and realized it was just noise. The real victory wasn't the trophy or the money. The real victory was the man he had become in the dark. He had reached the peak. He stood tall, feeling a deep, sacred peace. He had achieved a grand victory, not because he was lucky, but because he was relentless. He had the glory. He had the prize. But as the crowd cheered, his mind drifted back to the quiet room, the blank notebook, and the cold morning air. He realized that while the world loved his success, he loved the solitude that had created it. He was the master of the noise because he was first the master of the silence. Chapter 12. The Inner Fortress. The man who walked through the front door of the apartment after the grand ceremony was not the same man who had sat at the kitchen table in despair months ago. Elias looked at his surroundings, and for the first time, he saw a reflection of his internal order. The air in the room felt lighter. The messy piles of distraction were gone, replaced by a workspace that breathed with purpose and intent. His identity had shifted at the molecular level. Solitude was no longer a heavy chain he had to carry. It was the skin he wore. He no longer woke up at 5:00 a.m. because he felt forced to. He woke up because that was who he was. He was a man of the morning. He was a man of his word. He was a man who found strength in the quiet moments that others feared. Elias realized that the greatest transformation wasn't the contract or the applause. It was the death of his old, needy self, the man who begged for attention, the man who feared the silence, and the man who traded his soul for a like was finally dead. In his place stood someone who looked at a problem and saw a project. He looked at a failure and saw a lesson. He didn't avoid the world, but he was no longer a slave to its noise. His old friends noticed the change, too. When they saw him in the city, they didn't see the man who used to try so hard to be liked. They saw a calm gaze and a steady pulse. They didn't mock him anymore. They felt a sense of respect they couldn't quite explain. Elias had moved from striving to being. He didn't have to tell people he was disciplined. They could feel it in the way he moved and hear it in the clarity of his voice. Your mind is your primary home. Keep it clean, he thought as he organized his notes for the next day. He realized that most people spend their lives trying to change their results, but they never change their identity. They try to be successful without being disciplined. But Elias had learned the secret change the man in the silence. And the world will change around him in the light. He stood on his balcony, watching the city below. In the past, the noise of the traffic would have made him feel anxious or lonely. Now, it was just a background sound. To the peace he held inside, he had built an inner fortress, a sanctuary of character that no storm could knock down. He was no longer afraid of the dark, because he knew he carried the light of the sun inside his own routine. The blueprint was complete. He had reached a level of freedom that money could not buy. But a true master knows that wisdom is not a destination to be kept. It is a fire that must be shared with those still lost in the cold. He had the identity of a master. Now, it was time to leave a legacy. Chapter 13. The Teacher's Heart. True success is not measured by what you have, but by what you give back to the world. As the months passed, Elias realized that his journey through the silence was not just for him. His struggle, his pain, and his eventual victory had become a map for others to follow. He had moved from a man who was drowning in loneliness to a man who was a lighthouse for those lost at sea. One evening, after a long day at his executive office, Elias saw a young intern named Daniel sitting in the break room. Daniel looked exactly like Elias did a year ago, shoulders slumped, eyes dull with exhaustion, and his phone glowing with endless, meaningless notifications. Daniel was trying to hide his fear of being average behind a screen of noise. Elias didn't walk past him. He stopped, sat down, and shared the truth about the fortress of solitude. The secret is not in working more. Elias said softly, his English clear and powerful. The secret is in who you become before the world starts demanding your time. You are afraid to be alone because you are afraid of what the silence will tell you. But the silence is not your enemy. It is your greatest teacher. He handed Daniel his old journal, the one where he had written his first 5:00 a.m. blueprint. He shared the philosophy he had learned that discipline is the highest form of self-love. He explained that when you choose solitude over shallow noise, you are telling yourself that your future is more important than your current comfort. Elias looked back at his path with a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that the loss of his job, the betrayal of his friends, and the cold nights of doubt were not punishments. They were teachers. They were the fire that burned away the weak parts of his soul until only the iron remained. He learned that the sun rises every day to remind us that we can also start again. No matter how many times we have failed, his life was no longer about a promotion or a paycheck. It was about a legacy. He began to mentor others, showing them how to reclaim their mornings and, in doing so, reclaim their lives. He taught them that the 5:00 a.m. hour is a sacred space where you meet the person you were meant to be. He saw the lights in their eyes begin to burn with the same fire he had found in the darkness. As he stood by the vast ocean at dawn, watching the waves hit the shore, Elias felt a deep, eternal peace. He knew that even if he lost everything tomorrow, he would still be a king, because a king is not defined by his crown, but by his character. He had found a wisdom that was beyond money, the wisdom of a disciplined and solitary soul. But as the sun rose higher, Elias turned his gaze away from the horizon and toward the camera toward you. His journey was complete. He had built his fortress and survived the storm. He had found his voice and his victory. But what about you? The story of Elias is finishing. But your story is just beginning to be written. Your alarm is about to ring, and the world is waiting to see who you choose to be when the lights are low. Chapter 14. Building Your Fortress. We have traveled a long road together through the silence and the storm. We have watched Elias transform from a man drowning in the shallow noise of the world into a master of his own destiny. We have seen him battle the fear of being forgotten, the pain of isolation, and the crushing weight of his own doubt. But this story was never just about Elias. This story is about the fire that is currently dormant inside of you. At Level Up Graded Readers, we believe that language is a tool, but discipline is the foundation. You have listened to this journey for an hour, and in that time, your mind has absorbed more than just English vocabulary. You have absorbed a new mindset. You have seen that discipline, focus, courage, and being relentless are not just words on a screen. They are the bricks you must use to build your own future. Think about your own life right now. Are you a victim of the noise? Do you reach for your phone the moment you wake up because you are afraid of the silence? Do you seek the approval of strangers to feel like you matter? The truth is simple: if you do not learn to be alone, you will always be lonely. The fortress of solitude is not a place you go to hide from the world. It is the place you go to become strong enough to lead it. You now have the vocabulary of a creator. You know that consistency is the bridge to mastery. You know that small wins are the fuel for giant victories. You know that the dark night of the soul is not a punishment, but a test to see if you are truly ready for the light. Do not let this hour be a waste of your potential. Do not let these lessons fade away like a dream. The world is crowded with people who are fine. It is crowded with people who are waiting for luck, waiting for a sign, or waiting for someone to save them. But you are here. You are listening. You are the one who is hungry for a life that means something more. Your transformation starts this very second. It doesn't matter if it is noon or midnight. The commitment to your own greatness starts now. Throw away the excuses. Delete the distractions that steal your time. Set your alarm, not just on your phone, but in your heart. When you wake up tomorrow and the room is cold, and the silence feels heavy, remember Elias. Remember that the first step into the fortress is the hardest, but it is the only step that leads to true freedom. Don't wait for the world to notice you. Work in the dark until your success becomes the only noise the world can hear. We want to see your commitment to this new life. We want to know that you are ready to build your own fortress. Join our community of leaders and leave a comment below with the words, "I am not lonely. I am building." Tell us one skill you will refine in your solitude starting tomorrow. Subscribe to Level Up Graded Readers and take the first step toward the person you were meant to be. The blueprint is in your hands. The silence is waiting. Now, go and write a story that the world will never forget. Your time is now.